Hello there, welcome to saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground. And for those of you who lived through the late 80s into the early 90s, there's no way that you do not know about the Teenage Mutant Ninja or Hero Turtles, depending on where in the world you sit. Turtles' rise from comic book characters straight into the animated series, movies, and yes, eventually video games was well documented. And today we're taking a look at one of those video games, Fall of the Foot Clan, for the original Game Boy. Released in 1990, the game had a lot to overcome. The Game Boy's admittedly limited power and graphical limitations were a big part of that. Hell, the Turtles were, at least from the animated series, mostly identified from the different coloured masks they wore, and that was going to be completely irrelevant in a console where the entire thing was, well, green, or as we see here, black and white. So the creators came up with a rather unique way of using the different turtles. Granted, yes, they have each got their ever so slightly different weapons that only really look different when you're swinging them, quite frankly, but okay, they're different weapons. So instead of just picking which one of these you wanted to be and then realising there wasn't much difference, they actually used each of the 4 turtles as your 4 lives. You had a health bar with a certain amount of life, and when that eventually ran down to 0, that turtle was captured, and you had to choose a different turtle to continue the game with. It also had a fair few clever nods to the animated series. Pizza was used as a way of regaining your health, and all of your favourite characters from the show were visible, so it was quite well done in that sense. But what type of game was it? Well, as you can see visually, it was a side-scrolling fighting game. Very basic, literally side-scrolling. There wasn't even the walking up and down of a screen like you'd see in something like Double Dragon. This was literally left to right, jump, and swing whatever weapon you had. You could jump up to do a karate kick, you could hold down jump to do a higher jump, and if you knelt down, you could throw little shurikens, throwing stars, you know, all the fun stuff from the Turtles. In fairness to the game, it did have some very basic platform elements as well, so you could say technically it was a platform game with combat, or a side-scrolling combat game with platform. It doesn't really matter. Either way, both aspects were done in a very simplistic and basic way, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. What was a slightly unusual choice was the fact that you didn't actually have to play all the missions in order. You could just select to do mission 2 or mission 5 and go straight to the end. If you made it to the end of each level, you then got to face against one of the bosses, and these were your sort of primary villains from the cartoon show. Obviously the henchmen like Bebop and Rocksteady were in the first couple of levels. After that you go on to face the likes of Krang and Shredder towards the end. Whilst, as I said, you could go straight to the last level and instantly try and overcome that, if you did so, you wouldn't actually get to see the full ending to the game. It was still a very strange design choice, but overall, it's not too much of a negative, and I suppose from the concept of playing on a handheld, it was understandable. There were also some little bonus stages that you could take part in, and these were really strange. You basically had 10 attempts to find a secret number. You had to make your guesses, and Splinter would tell you whether they were larger or smaller. If anything, this was more than frustrating, really, but I suppose it gave the game a little bit of depth. So, how was the game received? Well, I don't know if it's because it was the Turtles and some liked it and some didn't, or whether it was because it was a handheld game and that put different limitations on it, but I've never seen a game with such vast and varied ratings. The scores I'm looking at went from between 40 to 91%. It's really bizarre to see. I mean, I can understand when retro reviews give such varying scores, but when magazines reviewing it right there and then at the time are giving it such a diverse range of scores, it's really hard to gauge. But how does it stand up now? Yes, it's modern scrutiny time, I know you love it, so here we go. Well, first of all, I've got to be honest, I played this, I had a Game Boy and I played it back then, and I remembered enjoying it. Going back to play it now, as you can see using the Cowabunga collection on the Nintendo Switch, well, it's not quite as good as it was. Look, I have no problem with there only being 5 levels. It was for a handheld console, and the oldest handheld console around at that. There was limitations because of what the console was, but also it was for play on the go. 5 levels is fine, and to be honest, the levels themselves are pretty varied. So I've got no issues with that. I actually really like the graphics. I think they still give a brilliant feel for that sort of cartoony style, and the design of each of the villains and things that you're fighting against are really good. The only graphical weakness that I think does actually stand out is that it's not in colour. Unfortunately, we've been conditioned to expect that in video games, so that does have an effect. Gameplay wise, it's still pretty intuitive and fun to play, but it is really repetitive. We'd be lying if we said if a game was presented at this and it wasn't the Turtles, we'd probably find it a little bit more tedious, but it does have the Turtles in it, and that comes with a degree of charm. It's still fun to play. I'm not gonna lie and pretend it's still world class, if it ever was. Hell, we saw that from how varied the scores were. But for me, it's still a really good game, and something I'll still enjoy playing. For me, I think this is a game that deserves a 7 out of 10. Yes, I am still holding in mind the limitations of the Game Boy when I say that, but I think that's fair. But what do you think? Let me know below, and remember, whatever you're doing today, take the high ground.